Resident Evil 4 needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway, because it practically reinvented survival horror nearly 20 years ago. But even with how gracefully the game has aged, there is one thing that can never be recaptured for longtime fans: the thrill of the unknown. Because short of using a neuralizer from Men in Black, there's just no way to experience this gem again for the first time. But we may now have the next best thing with the Resident Evil 4 Remake, which is a near complete reimagining of the entire game, featuring gorgeous new graphics, modern controls, revamped level designs, and fun twists that'll surprise even veterans of the original game. But the big question is, can the Resident Evil 4 Remake surpass the original? Now, the remake wastes no time in throwing you some curveballs. Let me tell you, it was a terrifying realization when I discovered that my strategy to camp atop the tower won't work this time. And the game is loaded with surprises like this, both big and small. Now, although the broad strokes of the adventure are largely identical with the same cast, settings, and general sequence of events, almost everything else has been reimagined to at least some degree. Because nearly every sequence has either been tweaked, greatly expanded upon, merged with another sequence, or created entirely out of whole cloth. And yes, a few scenes have been removed too, most of which you probably won't notice in the moment, besides one late game boss that seems to be missing entirely, which was a bit disappointing to me as I really enjoyed that battle. Now, whether or not every change taken individually is actually an improvement is almost beside the point, as what really mattered was that the game was constantly surprising me around every corner, often in small ways but sometimes big ones too. But to spoil too many of them would deprive you of the same joy that I had too. And these changes ensured I always had to be on my toes, as what I thought I knew from the previous game doesn't mean a whole lot with the revamped level designs and mechanics. And that's especially the case when it comes to the combat. Now, one of the hallmarks of the original Resident Evil 4 was a stop and pop gameplay, forcing you to decide when to attack and when to flee, as you damn well couldn't do both at the same time. And I was worried that the remake might screw up this delicate balancing act with its increased versatility, as not only can you now move and shoot at the same time, but you can even reload your weaponry while on the run. So I was happy to find out that the developers struck a near perfect balance, as your movement is just slow enough when aiming that you can't easily escape danger without lowering your weapon. However, with the increased versatility also comes far more aggressive enemies, with much faster movements, surprising attacks, and less exploitable AI in general. Distance alone isn't the safety net it used to be, as this game finds new ways to pressure you almost constantly. Perhaps a little bit too much at times. Because the remake doesn't mess around when it comes to difficulty, at least on the hardcore mode, which is the hardest option available from the start, and the one that the game recommends for experienced Resident Evil 4 players. But despite being one myself, I thoroughly got my ass kicked for most of the 30-hour playtime. Enemies are now tougher and more resilient to being staggered, and they can annoyingly chain attacks together before you've even had a chance to recover. Especially since Leon is now vulnerable during some animations too, like when climbing ladders. In short, the Resident Evil 4 remake can feel relentless. It provides near constant pressure from start to finish with nary a chance to catch your breath, and the unrelenting pace nearly did burn me out at times. It probably didn't help that my inventory was running on near empty for most of the adventure, to the point that upgrading my attaché case's size would have been a waste of money. There were multiple times where I thought I was completely screwed due to my lack of ammo and items during intense battles, but I somehow managed to pull through in the end. I would have appreciated the game allowed me to change the difficulty at any time, but that's only possible as a one-time toggle on the standard difficulty, where it'll allow you to permanently knock it down to the assistant mode after dying. Now, to help give you a fighting chance, your combat knife has been reimagined too, now allowing you to parry powerful enemy attacks, including chainsaws, in addition to delivering a finishing blow to downed enemies to make sure they don't turn into a nasty parasite. You can even use it for sneaky insta-kills too. It's a great upgrade, but there is a catch, because the knife can wear down and eventually break this time, which prevents it from being abused like in the original game. Thankfully, it can be fixed at the nearest merchant, at a price of course. Oh, and speaking of the merchant, not only is he still the best character in the game, but he's actually better than ever.
I've got some new items in stock,
as he has a ton more to say, including some truly hilarious lines.
Don't get yourself killed now.
He's perfect and I love him so much. Of course, he's not just here for conversation, as he can still sell the treasure he found along the way to pay for the items and upgrades that he sells. The developers have also given him a wider range of side missions for you too, whether it's exterminating rats or shooting medallions or selling snakes, among many others. But this time around, you're awarded in gems that act as a second currency that you can use to trade in for exclusive goods, such as the classic laser sight, treasure maps of each region, and plenty more. They can be a nice diversion, though they just as often feel like busy work, and I didn't feel especially compelled to finish most of them. The inventory screen has also seen some improvements. like how you can now auto-sort it with a simple click of the left stick. It's not perfect, sometimes placing similar items on opposite sides of the case, and oddly, it even sometimes leaves gaps you have to manually reclaim. But overall, it's a huge time saver, especially since you'll be accessing your inventory more than ever thanks to the addition to craftable resources, from which you can make things like different ammo types or grenades. Now, I'm not generally a huge fan of crafting in games, but it's pretty harmless here. Furthermore, while I love that you can still pause the game to access your inventory during combat, as I find it only adds to the suspense and strategy, the addition of a quick select menu via the D-pad is a nice shortcut. When it comes to the overall presentation, the remake feels a little more grounded than before. While it does retain some of that amazing B-horror movie cheese that the original is infamous for, the more outlandish moments have definitely been toned down. Rest in peace, your right hand comes off. Conversely, the story, characters, and their motivations are better fleshed out in the remake, largely thanks to longer and more frequent interactions. While Leon's personality is basically unchanged, others have been tweaked a noticeable amount, such as Ashley, who's now more mature and self-assured. Now, although not every new interpretation may win you over instantly, like Luis in my case, I really ended up coming around on him by the end, especially with his vastly increased presence. But I wasn't fully on board with how the villains have been reinterpreted, like how Salazar is notably restrained compared to the impertinent man-child he used to be. And Sadler's new performance isn't nearly as intimidating. Visually, the Resident Evil 4 remake is stunning. The not zombies look more disgusting than ever, and the lighting is next level compared to the original game, especially if you turn on the ray traced reflections. Although I do have to say that the game is just too damn dark at times, especially because Leon barely uses the flashlight he has on him, and there were many instances where I couldn't tell what was going on around me, whereas that was never a problem in the original game. But all of the new added detail is fantastic. The village in particular looks amazing now. You'll also find that the backdrops throughout the game have been greatly expanded too. But I do have to say that the rain effect looks shockingly bad. Can someone please explain to me why it's following me around? Now, the developers have said that'll be improved in the day one patch, but to what extent is unknown. Thankfully, the game ran at a nearly flawless 60 frames per second for me on PS5, even with the options for ray tracing and better hair enabled. Outside of the rain, the only part of the presentation I found underwhelming is the music. It's certainly still good, don't get me wrong, but it fails to set the mood as effectively as in the original game. Even though the broad strokes of the adventure are quite similar, it's easy to forget that in the heat of the moment, as I was almost always wondering what's going to happen next. Some sequences are clearly improved in my opinion, like how the minecart ride has been completely revamped to the point that it's basically this level from Donkey Kong 64, which is awesome. But I found the boss fights to be a little more uneven, with some being virtually unchanged, while others were almost entirely reimagined. Sometimes for the better, like this Krauser battle that's no longer just a QTE fest, but sometimes for the worse too. One boss in particular nearly caused me to pull my hair out in frustration from a lack of clarity in his attacks. That aside, for as great as most of the additions are, I can't help but feel it falls short in a few, perhaps intangible ways. There was almost a cadence or rhythm to the original game's combat that isn't quite recaptured here. There was just a chunkier feel to the original that I kinda miss, and the atmosphere here doesn't feel quite as thick in some cases. And then there's the fact that the remake often trades in some of the original suspense for surprise. Now, I found the original to be a near masterclass in ramping up tension and dread, which are both things I felt a little less often in the remake during some key moments. Although the trade-off was mostly worth it, as I really dug all the little surprises, even if it made the journey a little less suspenseful and scary than before. Ultimately, the developers of the Resident Evil 4 remake had a nearly impossible task at hand. How do you even reimagine a game to feel different while remaining faithful at the same time? And I have to say that the remake does an admirable job of threading that needle, by updating the game for modern taste without betraying most of what made the original so great. And the fact that the game was able to surprise me at all makes me extremely happy, even if I can't help but wonder what might have been possible had the developers really been able to let loose. So that brings us back to the big question: does the Resident Evil 4 remake surpass the original? I'm sure for many, it will, especially for those who played this version of the game first. The remake looks incredible, terrible rain aside, the control scheme is undoubtedly more intuitive, and it still features most of the amazing moments that made the original game so great, all the while changing it up just enough to make it still exciting for longtime fans too. But, as one who knows the original game like the back of my hand, it's also not hard to compare them at every turn. And even though some changes are unequivocally for the better, others are a little more questionable. So even if it may not quite surpass the original game for me, I'm happy it exists at all, as it allowed me to revisit the classic in a way that no playthrough since my first one had nearly 20 years ago, even if it obviously can't make the same impact again. So for now, I like the Resident Evil 4 remake a lot, and I wouldn't be surprised if my fondness grows stronger over time. So there you have it, GameXplain's review of the Resident Evil 4 Remake. Thank you so much for watching, and of course stay tuned to GameXplain for more on the Resident Evil 4 Remake and everything else Resident Evil 2. We'll catch you later. Bye everyone!